All right, so let's go ahead and get started. I assume people will kind of trickle in and out as we get going, but let's get going. Welcome to our session. It's called In Their Own Words, Using Empathy Mapping to Create Inclusive Learning Experiences. If you're looking for the mini grant or the trio session, you definitely need to find another WebEx link. But if you're here for empathy mapping, you are in the right place. So just before we get going, I've got a little bit of housekeeping to share. Um, so we will be using the chat function in WebEx for our Q&A today. So you can find the chat by looking in the bottom right-hand corner of your WebEx menu, and it should be there as a little speech bubble that says chat. So that's where we'll kind of ask questions, share responses, that sort of thing. You are audio muted at upon your entry into this meeting. So if you do wish to speak when we have the opportunity, you'll need to unmute yourself. Other times, please stay muted just because we might get some feedback, or you might unintentionally kind of share more about your personal life than you may want it to if you find yourself unmuted and don't realize it. I've definitely heard that in some meetings. So as far as video goes, it's totally up to you if you want to stay video muted or unvideo mute yourself so we can see you. We do think that if you are speaking, it might be good if you could unvideo mute yourself, but of course that is totally your choice and is not required at all. So feel free to stay muted if that's kind of what you're feeling this morning. And I just have a really quick kind of legalese CYA paragraph here I have to read. So we are recording this session so that we can share it with all registered attendees and for those who could not participate in the conference today. If you do not wish to be recorded, please keep your video turned off and or continue to mute your microphone. If you turn on your video and or your microphone, you are consenting to be recorded. Thank you. So yep, we are recording. If you don't want to appear in that recording, just please stay video and audio muted. Otherwise, you will probably show up in that recording somewhere. All right, so if you have not, feel free to just throw in the chat where you're from, what your role is. So if you're an instructor, what do you teach? If you're not an instructor, what is your role at your institution? So to that end, I'm also going to introduce me and my team really quick. So my name is Jef Fisher. I'm one of the instructional designers here at Western. So I'm joined today by Alyssa and Matt, Megan, and I don't think I saw Alex on the call, but we also have Alex who works with us as a developer. So as instructional designers, we work with folks who are interested in designing, developing learning experiences, so helping them think through what that might look like. So we're hoping today to share a little bit of that process with you, and also to learn from you to see kind of how you approach some of these issues that we'll discuss. All right, so our objectives for the session today are going to be to describe design thinking and its relevance to instructional design. So thinking about these ideas of design thinking and how we can use them in our practice. And then taking those ideas and actually applying them to create an empathy map. So the session is kind of split into two portions today, starting off with, kind of the talky bit, kind of me talking at you, which is not my preferred mode of being. So that's going to be kind of more of that describe design thinking, getting that base knowledge understanding. Then in the second half, we'll have a chance for that application. You'll actually get to build one of these empathy maps. All right, and so just a really quick question for you before we get going. What do you hope to get out of this experience? So what drew you to this session, and what kind of things are you hoping to get out of it? So just take maybe 30 seconds to a minute. It doesn't have to be super well thought out. If you could just throw a response in the chat. All right, and Tony, yeah, the concept of empathy mapping, we should definitely be able to help with that. That is a shared goal that we have. Applying design concepts, yep, we'll definitely get into that. More about empathy mapping. So perfect, seems like a lot of our goals are aligning here. So we hope that we can help you accomplish that today. So, all right, so let's get into it. Like I said, we have to just briefly talk about kind of design thinking, so we're all kind of coming from the same way. We all have an understanding of where this idea is coming from. So as we get into this, just a couple questions for you. So have you heard of design thinking before? And if yes, what do you know about it? So just kind of seeing where we're at in terms of our understanding of these ideas. Again, this doesn't have to be, it's not an exam. It doesn't have to be super thorough, just kind of off the top of your head. All right, so seeing a couple different answers in the chat. So yes, for the most part, but it seems like some folks have very little exposure to this. And then looks like Alex touched on something very important to design thinking, which is the post-its and the stickers. So yes, a lot of different creative opportunities here to get up, move around, put sticky notes on walls, on whiteboards, that sort of thing. So we'll be doing that digitally today, but definitely encourage you to, once you're comfortable back being in a room with folks, to try some of these techniques in person. I also love the post-its, Lasanda. All right. So it looks like we do have kind of a range of experience with design thinking, and that's totally fine. Like I said, we'll go over just a quick overview of these ideas. Yes, Mary, IDEO is a great resource for this kind of stuff. All right, so getting into design thinking. So at its core, design thinking really is kind of, problem solving process or a way of approaching problems in the development of solutions that really kind of prioritizes the end user. So that's kind of our starting point is thinking of, who are we designing for? How can we help them solve their problems? And we don't expect you to be an expert in this today. I'm definitely not an expert in this at all and wouldn't claim to be. We really just, like I said, wanted you to be able to situate where this empathy map activity is coming from. So as a kind of problem solving process or toolkit, design thinking has several different phases. So our first phase is going to be the empathize phase. So as I mentioned, we really want to start by looking at our target audience. So, who are we designing for? What problem are they trying to solve? What are their wants and needs? And, what other things do we know about them that are relevant to our problem solving process? So this phase would likely involve things like interviews, focus groups, observations, just these different ways that we can collect kind of data about our audience. Once we have kind of that base level understanding of who it is we're working for, we then want to move into our definition phase, our define phase. And so this is really just the time for us to kind of lay out clearly what is the problem that we're trying to solve. And the thing I try to remember here is, not necessarily framing this as, what we want to do, but what problem are our users trying to solve and how can we help them solve that? So not necessarily like, what do I want to do for you? What can I do for you? But how can I help you reach your goals, essentially? And that's kind of a subtle shift there, but I try to be mindful of that as I think through this. All right, next we have our ideate phase. So, we've done our empathizing, thought through who our audience is, we've defined that problem, and now it's time to start generating ideas about how we're going to solve that problem. So this would involve, brainstorming, and there are all kinds of different strategies that you can use to creatively think about problems and generate ideas. So one fun one just off the top of my head is kind of, like the worst possible solution. So kind of flipping the script and thinking, how could we do this the worst way possible, which then might kind of inform the things that you want to do in a positive sense. During this phase, there's really an emphasis on idea generation. So trying to get those thoughts out, not necessarily moving into judgment, evaluation, that sort of thing. All right, and then our next phase is going to be the prototype phase. So, at this point, we've analyzed the audience, we've defined our problem, generated ideas. We now need to begin to create, a concrete plan and to make something. And the level of complexity of our prototype is going to vary widely. So we think of this idea of the MVP, or the minimum viable product. And that's basically what is the most basic solution that we can think of that's still going to count as, the solution to our problem. It's still going to work as our design. So if you think about a class, an MVP for a class is probably going to involve, some form of instruction, some form of assessment. That's kind of like, maybe our bare minimum of what we're going to consider a class. And then from there, from the MVP, we can think about kind of, a good, better, best model. So what is kind of our good solution? What is kind of a better solution? And then what is kind of our, ideal dream world scenario? If we had all the time in the world, all the resources, what would we want to do? So that's kind of our prototype moving from that MVP, the minimum viable product, all the way up to what is, kind of our best solution that we can get to eventually. All right, and once we've got that prototype, we're then going to move into our testing phase. So we've developed something, we've got to get it in front of our audience and see how well it works, right? Is this the solution to our problem? How can we change it in the future? What things do we want to change immediately? What are maybe some of those longer term best solutions we might want to start working on implementing? Um, and then how does what we learned during this phase kind of link back to the empathy phase, right? So this is a chance to collect more data and think through, once again, the audience's point of view. Is this working for them? If not, what do we need to change? And so a quick note about these phases. They're laid out here in a linear order, and you'll often see them presented this way, but that doesn't mean that you have to move through these sequentially. You might kind of bounce back and forth. You might move through them in a different order. They're really just kind of, like I said, a way of helping you approach solving that problem. So maybe you get to ideate and you want to go back to empathize. That's totally allowed. It's not, a super rigid sequence. All right. So like I said, that's just kind of our quick and dirty overview of design thinking. You don't need to be an expert in this, but it's going to help you understand where mapping is coming from. It's going to come out of that empathize phase of design thinking. All right. So now we are going to move into talking about empathy mapping. So like I said, a key part of design thinking is empathy, trying to envision what our target audience, thinks, feels, does, needs, wants, that sort of thing. And one technique for doing that is going to be this empathy mapping. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share a sample empathy map, and we'll kind of talk through what this looks like and how we're going to use it. All right, so are we seeing this image of a sample empathy map? We are, perfect. All right. So looking at the empathy map, what kind of things do you notice? Feel free to share in the chat just what are your observations? Yep, so 4 quadrants, definitely. And there are different ways that you can set this up. This is kind of the classic example with the 4 quadrants. I've seen different ways of doing this, but yep, so we've got our quadrants. And Tony mentioned the person in the center. So yeah, and that person is going to be our audience, right? So just reminding us that this is the person that we're thinking about as we do this activity. Various ways to consider the process. Yeah, so things like thinking through different aspects of the user, right? So what are they saying? What are they doing? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? So it's kind of split into our observable phenomena. So things like I said, what are they saying? What are they doing? Things you can actually observe. And then kind of our more inferred side, right? So the more internal things like what are they thinking? What are they feeling? And Mary says, "Yep, Jamie is struggling with buying a TV and is frustrated by the process." So in this scenario, that is the problem they're trying to solve. And in a lot of cases, this is used for kind of product design, but we can definitely adapt it to think through our own design problems. All right, a couple more things that I want to note here. So we have all these sticky notes essentially, and in an ideal world, we would pull this from actual data, right? So we would get this from kind of our end of semester surveys or, informal surveys we've done throughout the semester, maybe just informal observations we've made of students as they're going through our learning experiences. Any kind of way that we can collect that data, that's going to strengthen this map as a tool, right? Because like I said, with design thinking, we don't want it to be how we feel about our audience or what we think they feel. We want to try to rely on their actual input as much as possible. So we won't really necessarily have that today just because this is kind of a demonstration, but in the future, definitely something to keep in mind. And one last note, we really only need to include things relevant to the project at hand on this map. So we might know for whatever reason that Jamie ate oatmeal for breakfast this morning, but that doesn't mean we need to add that to our does quadrant. That's not useful for this problem necessarily. All right, and so this empathy map idea, it's not necessarily going to be part of a lot of formal course development models you might see, but hopefully this is a tool that's going to encourage us to, as we design and develop learning experiences, to think about it from that kind of human-centered, learner-centered perspective. So once we've developed this map, we can refer back to it at kind of every stage of our development. So while we're developing it, after we've developed it, we can use this as a self-assessment tool to kind of filter all of our design decisions through that lens of how the student is feeling. And so that's kind of how this fits into this framework of assessment. It's not really assessing students per se, it's more assessing your own work. Though, of course, you might take this empathy map and use it as an assignment in a class, depending on, if it's relevant to your discipline. If you're in design, you're probably already using something like this, but it might be useful outside of that strict field of, design and development. All right, so any questions about this empathy map, the sample, before we move into actually creating an empathy map? All right, so hearing none, seeing none, we're now going to move on to actually creating our empathy maps. So we are going to give you a couple options here. So I'm going to be working in a tool called Miro. And this is kind of an interactive virtual whiteboard. If you don't want to mess around with Miro, if Miro isn't working for you, if it just seems like kind of a bridge too far for this morning, you don't want to fool around with learning another tech tool, you're totally welcome to follow along on paper. So a piece of paper with a pen or a pencil works just as well. You'll be able to kind of quickly sketch what we're doing. Really is just kind of a cross. So, but if you want to join us in Miro, please hop over to the link that Alyssa shared in the chat. Once everyone's in Miro, I'll kind of walk through how to use this tool. Okay, so if you are in Miro, I now suggest maybe you take your hand off your mouse. You don't worry about interacting with Miro right now. I'm going to bring you to me so I can kind of demonstrate how we're going to use this board. Just really quick instructions. All right, so everyone should be over here with me where it says Miro Learning Area. So like I said, if you move, it's going to let you move away. So maybe just kind of sit still for now. So we only need to do a couple things in Miro today, and luckily they're all pretty simple. So the first thing is just we need to be able to move. So there are kind of two move functions in Miro. There's the select tool and the move tool. So if your cursor is currently shaped like an arrow, like mine is, this is the select tool. This means I can kind of drag and select different objects. We don't need that today. So you're not really selecting and moving anything today. So be careful with that one. What you'll need to do is you'll need to be able to move around. You'll need to be able to move the Miro board. So to do that, you just click on the left-hand side here. There should be this vertical looking menu. And at the very top, there's going to be an option to change your select into your move. So if it's blue, that means you're currently in select. You're selecting objects. If it's black, that means you're moving. So then when you go back to the Miro board, your cursor will become a hand. And if you click, you'll realize that you can now move the Miro board around. You can navigate to different areas. So again, don't navigate too far because I've got more things to show you, but you now have that ability if you did not before. So kind of achievement unlocked. All right, the next thing you're likely going to need to be able to do is utilize the zoom function. So there are different scales in Miro. We can get really, zoomed in, zoomed out, that sort of thing. So to zoom, you should see in the lower right-hand corner a percentage with a minus and a plus next to it. So if you click the plus, you're going to zoom in. If you click the minus, you're going to zoom out. If you have a scroll wheel on your mouse, if you're using a desktop or a USB mouse, you can also use the scroll wheel to scroll in and out. All right, so that is how we zoom. That's going to be pretty essential. All right, and one last thing we need to be able to do, we need to be able to type in a sticky note. So anywhere you see one of these sticky notes, which you'll see later on when we get into our empathy maps, if you just double click on it, you can then begin typing. And the cool thing about these sticky notes is they'll automatically kind of adjust the font for you. So if you type a lot, it's going to make the font smaller. If you type a little bit, it'll make that font bigger for you. So that should automatically configure that for you so you don't have to play around with the font size. All right, so that is really all we need to be able to do in Miro. We need to be able to move around, need to be able to type in a sticky note, and need to be able to zoom in and out. So like I said, if this seems too much, definitely just hop onto that piece of paper with a pen or a pencil. All right, so now we are going to actually get into building an empathy map. So once again, I'm going to bring you all to me. So you'll want to kind of maybe just hands off your mouse for now, otherwise you'll kind of go flying somewhere else. So our empathy map in Miro looks a little different. If you were doing this on a whiteboard face-to-face, you could kind of draw that audience member in the middle, but for today, we're not going to do that. And another note about the audience. So typically for audience, we would want to do, as singular as possible. So can we focus on an individual? For our purposes, we're going to kind of work with, kind of a conglomerated idea of who our audience is. And so this gets a little tricky in practice, and you can consider different ways of doing this. So maybe, you do like a handful of individual students in different empathy maps for each one. Or maybe you do something like if you have, adult learners, returning learners, or a group of dual enrolled students in your class, maybe you can do an empathy map for the different, varieties of students per se. But for today, we'll just kind of do a general example. So for us as instructional designers, we often give presentations just like this one, right? We give workshops, that sort of thing. So for our example, that's who we're thinking about, is who attends our workshops. So just kind of thinking of some general characteristics of who we get at these things. So for audience, I'd think something like, full-time instructors. Just a quick note about who these folks are. Part-time instructors, varying levels of tech knowledge, varying levels of pedagogical knowledge. So just a couple characteristics to keep in mind as you move through this process. It's not meant to be a whole sketch of who this person is, just relevant characteristics that I'll need to keep in mind. All right, so that is our first step. So now I'm going to kind of set you loose for a couple minutes to go find your own empathy map. So you should have an empathy map over here somewhere in this area. And I want you to just fill out that audience portion. So like I said, just thinking characteristics of who your students are, who you tend to see. I'll give you about 2 minutes to do that. Once again, it doesn't have to be super in-depth. For me, it was just a couple sticky notes. So go ahead and just jot down some thoughts about your audience. If you can't find your board, there is a search function up here. So if you click on that magnifying glass, you could search for your name. And remember, we're not yet getting into that says, does, thinks, feels. This really is just general characteristics of our audience. All right. Do we have anyone who wants to volunteer to share what they put in the audience category? You could either just maybe type it in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, you could briefly talk us through it. I can zoom in on your board here.
You asked us if we wanted to share who was in our map.
Yeah, if you want to just share the thoughts that you jotted down in that audience section.
Okay. This is Lasanda.
Okay.
If I did this correctly, I did students, faculty, community, employers, high school students, other colleges, other departments. I probably should say other departments at my college and in the state of Michigan.
So this is your audience then for whatever type of thing you're developing.
Yeah.
Yeah, yep. Then you did it perfectly well, Lasana. Thank you for volunteering to
Okay.
share. And like I said, it does get kind of tricky when we're trying to do it as this conglomerate because we're going to get maybe some conflicting thoughts here later on. So this might be a case where we say, I'm going to do one for my students, one for faculty, and think about it that way. But yeah, thank you for sharing. All right, so we are a little crunched on time, I think, so we'll keep moving here. But the cool thing about Miro is that you can go back and kind of look at what your peers have done. So I definitely encourage you to check that out later as we move forward. All right, so now I'm going to bring you all back to me. All right, so we're back to our sample ID board. So now we're moving on, having kind of thought about that audience, to think about what the audience says. Like I said, this is literally observable things that I've heard people say. So for me, if I'm at a workshop, if I'm leading a workshop, this is going to be the things I've heard my audience say. So it might be things like, "Can you zoom in?" I can't see what's on the screen. So that's going to be a design consideration I take into the future of like, oh, if they can't see, I need to revise the way I'm doing this, right? Or it might be something like, how would I use this? What's the context for this? What's the relevancy? And so we can kind of start to see where collecting these ideas is going to be useful as we think about redesigning and redeveloping these learning experiences. All right, so those are just a couple examples, like I said, from my work, but really, like I said, thinking through things you've actually heard. So maybe it's in the classroom observations you've made, maybe it's responses you got on a survey, that sort of thing. So what does your audience actually say, um, either in response to a presentation you've already given or just kind of in general? So giving you about 5 minutes for this one. Try to brainstorm for that says quadrant.
Jeff, could you provide the prompt again for the says quadrant? What are we doing?
Yeah, yep. So for the says, like that's things you can observe from your audience. So in my example, it was, when I give a presentation, things I've heard in the past from my audience are, can you zoom in on that? Like I can't see what you're trying to show me on the screen. Or, I've heard people say things like, this is neat, but like, how would I use this? So those are just comments that I've picked up in the past. And then in the future, when I go to build something, I want to keep those in mind, right? So it's good to collect those into that says quadrant. Does that kind of explain?
So in terms of if the audience were students that we teach in our classes, then what does the says quadrant? I'm confused at how that translates, how I should be thinking about that.
Yep. So I would think in terms of the classroom, you know, what types of things have you heard students say about your class? Have they said things like, this is too much work? Have they said things like, I really like when you do this thing. I really like when you take 5 minutes at the start of class to ask us how we're doing. Things like that. So what, comments have you heard? And like I said, it might be they've literally told you these things, you've literally heard them out loud, or it might be, things you've collected from student surveys, that sort of thing. And like I said, in an ideal world, we would have already been able to collect that data and would bring that to that process so we could just kind of pull it right out of that collection of data. But for today, it's more just kind of a demonstration. Does that
Yep,
make a little more
that makes
sense?
sense. Yep,
Okay,
thank you.
perfect. Thank you for your question. All right, and Christopher has asked an excellent question. So if they tell you they do something, does it go in says or does? I think it could go in either, really. So really, this is just kind of set up to help you collect this information and organize it. Some of these boundaries get a little permeable, I should say. So it doesn't necessarily matter that it's in the right quadrant per se, as long as you have it on there and it's something that you're going to think about in the future. So for that one, it's up to you. I might put it in the does just because it's helpful to think about that as, okay, this is what they're doing. So for example, if a student tells you like, I don't do the reading, I'd probably put that in the does. But all right, so kind of the same as last time. I see a lot of filled out quadrants there for says. Do we have anyone who wants to just quickly kind of describe what they put there? And if not, that's totally fine. Like I said, this is going to remain open to you. You'll have this link, so you can definitely go back and look at what folks are doing later. All right, so I'm going to bring you back to me one more time here. And so now we are looking at that does quadrant. So this is our other observable quadrant. So if says is kind of, the ideas that we're hearing from folks that they're sharing with us, does is, actual observations of things they're doing. So kind of sticking with my example. So things that people are doing during my workshops that I've noticed. So they might be multitasking. I would expect them to, because I've done this in the past. You always have the email open in the corner, but we can usually tell, right? So that's one thing they're doing is they're multitasking. Another thing they're doing is, um, maybe they're leaning in close to the screen. So like I said, kind of sometimes they ask to zoom in. The correlate of that in the does quadrant is them physically kind of, sometimes you see this, and that's kind of a hint that maybe it's not working so well, right? So maybe they're, working on their own class in the background. They're doing other stuff in the background like that. They're maybe actually applying this to their class though. And maybe that kind of gives me a hint of where I could take the workshop in the future. Instead of having them practice in a sample course, maybe I open it up to let them practice in their own course and start building things in there right away. So that's our does quadrant. Like I said, things you observe. So if we think about the classroom, this might be something like, students aren't paying attention, or it might be something positive though, right? It might be saying like, they get engaged when I do this. When I ask certain types of questions or build certain things into my lessons, they come alive more, that sort of thing. So it doesn't always have to be negative, right? So go ahead, same thing. I'll give you about 5 minutes again to fill, we'll do about 4 minutes for this one. Go ahead and fill out that does quadrant, just trying to get some ideas out there. Typically, you would not have to do this at such a rapid fire pace. You'd have time, like I said, to kind of sift through any data you were able to collect, think through this maybe a little more intentionally, but once again, just kind of demonstrating the process. All right, so I'm gonna bring you over to me again to just briefly talk here about the thinks and feels. And so this is where it gets a little trickier because, like I said, these are less observable and more inferable, right? We have to try to infer how someone's thinking or feeling. But if we can, we still want to base this in kind of that data that we have. So, if people are saying this, if they're doing this, how are they thinking about this, right? And how is this making them feel? So, good example for feel, if I'm finding people are, they're not following along in the workshop and they're having trouble with the tech, they want me to zoom in more, that sort of thing, I'm gonna think that they probably feel overwhelmed, right? And if they have a lot going on, this maybe isn't a high priority for them, they might feel, distracted, right? So maybe that's kind of why they're multitasking. It's because they're distracted. It's not just because they want to do it for fun. It's, hey, I've got 50 emails in my inbox I need to address. So feels, that sort of thing. And then how are they thinking, right? So what kind of thoughts do they have here? So it looks like, reminders should be sent. Yeah, exactly. So maybe that's a thought they're having is like, oh, reminders should be sent. Or, you know, if it's a workshop, maybe a thought is, could this be automated, right? So instead of me having to be here with you at this time when I'm trying to make dinner and my kids just got home from school, could you make this automatic for me? That sort of thing. So, like I said, these get a little trickier, especially when we don't have that data with us right now, but just take about 5 minutes here to jot down any ideas you have for the thinks or feels quadrants in your empathy map. All right, so let's now kind of look at how we would finish this activity up. So after we've gone through and filled out those different quadrants, the next thing we'd kind of want to look at is, are there patterns? Are there clusters of ideas represented here? So an example of that might be, in my does quadrant, I see multitasking. I also see something like working on their own class. So those ideas kind of go together, right? They're, kind of doing things while my workshop's going on, and then I can maybe dig into that a little deeper. Like, are these, positive multitasks? Are they applying this content in a useful way, or is it more kind of like getting distracted, getting pulled away, that sort of thing? So that would kind of be our next step, is looking at, are there any connections we can make between ideas, any clusters of ideas? And after we've kind of gone through and done that, we then want to reflect on this. That's kind of what my hidden prompts are here, is just some reflection prompts. So after you go through this process, you complete this empathy map, just thinking about what this means. So, like, what are some observations that are most interesting to you in the map? What really jumps out at you as useful? What surprised you in the map? Did you learn things about your students that you didn't initially think about by doing this activity? What might be missing in the map? So are you overlooking things? Are there different sources of data you might need to consider to fill out some of those other quadrants? What are some assumptions in the map? So are there, things that you're assuming about students, things that students are assuming about the experience? I know for me, kind of goes together here. The what's missing and what are some assumptions are, typically when I do this, it seems to kind of trend towards the negative, right? So that's kind of what's missing for me is the positive aspect, and I'm assuming that students are only having problems. I'm not really focusing on what's going well. And then finally, what would you like to investigate further? So really thinking meaningfully about what's missing from this picture. So I do encourage you to, take some time either when the session's over or later today to reflect on that empathy map and kind of go through those prompts and see what you come up with based on what you've done today. All right, so we are just kind of about out of time here. So I do want to save a little bit of time to open this up for questions. If anyone has any questions about this or how you might use it, how it applies to what you're doing in the classroom, I'm more than welcome to take those now. We'll also share a few links for you in the chat as far as surveys to complete and that sort of thing.
Thank you for leading us through this process. I did have a question. I feel like this would be an interesting thing to do with my team. I have 3 grant programs in my unit. And everyone is, of course, trying to innovate, figure out how we get students back involved post-COVID, all of the things. So do you think that this is something that could be worked on, like pretty much like large group, to get them to, have some good feedback and be able to implement things by fall?
Yeah, I definitely think, and honestly, I think this activity it can even shine more when you do have a group. It's one thing to kind of, do it on your own and kind of your own silo, and you have like your own ideas, but the more voices you have there, the more perspective they're going to have on the data you're bringing to the table. The more data you'll probably be able to bring, because you have people who specialize in different things. So I definitely recommend this as a team activity. Does Miro have this as a template? I think I see Matt is shaking his head yes. I think they do have a template for this. So Miro has a lot of great templates related to things like design thinking, project management. So they do have that template. I'm not sure I have the link handy for you, unfortunately, but that might be something we can dig up. I think Matt's doing some digging now.
When you're in Miro, in the menu bar on the left-hand side, there is one of the icons that's actually for templates. It looks like a square with 2 lines in it that kind of make a lopsided T. If you click on that, you can, in the search box, type in empathy map and it pulls up one for you. And there is a template there. But I think we also have one that's been created in a document form that's been linked in the chat as well.
So let me just maybe walk through that really quick. So yeah, if you go to Miro, when you log into your dashboards, templates are going to be right here, show all templates. And then you can search this, like I said, wide plethora of templates for all kinds of different stuff. So I think Matt said if we just search empathy map, yeah, looks like, you've got this template here. Yep. And like I said, this one, sometimes these have different prompts, different things in the quadrant. This one looks a little different, but it's totally fine. It all gets you kind of towards the same goal in the end, which is really thinking mindfully about who you're designing for as you're doing that development, something that you can look back at as you're going throughout that process to see if it's jiving with what you've developed at the start. All right. Any other questions or comments, concerns? Otherwise, you can go reclaim about 2 minutes on your lunch. This is kind of a crazy day, back to back to back, I know. So, all right. So if no one else has any other questions or anything they want to ask about, that is all we have for you today for this morning. So thank you for attending and participating. And we'll see you in the next ones.